The following audio is via a Skype call.
Welcome to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Get ready to find your free will from your roots in the stars.
Hi, Sue Rose Minahan, Talk Cosmos. Today is Eclipse Day. Earlier, it was 3 o'clock in the morning here on the West Coast, we had an eclipse on the globe. That is Gaia, the globe, Earth, because it isn't evident everywhere that we live, but eclipses are a regular pattern, and astrology follows patterns. It follows cycles. We have a sun. We're in the month of Leo, and planets revolve around the sun. The sun gives its light, and the time of an eclipse, because of the coordinated orbits, the light goes out for a while. Now, this wasn't particularly a full eclipse. For one reason, it happens to have a number. It's 155 Saros. Saros is you spell it Saros for those people that are not astrologers. It is one of the beginnings of the 71 events that happened within 1,000 years. It's a long cycle. And this is about number 6. The first one was back in 1928, happened to be June 17th. And I've learned that that's when Amelia Earhart went across the Atlantic. So it is the beginning. Often, because of the huge span, we're in the middle. Like the lunar eclipse that we had was a total one because it was in the middle of the whole cycle. We're at the beginning. And as it's been pointed out, it's a bit unusual to start at the beginning when you consider the vast amount of time, or ending for that matter. So in this case, when it's at the beginning, it's far away from the nodes, and that's of the moon. Again, these are points in space as between the orbits of the moon with the Earth orbit. And if it's within 18 degrees, there's 30 degrees in a house, it is considered an eclipse. And as it approaches closer and closer to those nodes, it would be total, like in the case of the lunar eclipse that had just passed. We are in what we call an eclipse season. It happens to be 3 in this pattern, which isn't that common, although I believe that the United States was after its July 4th, 1776, in a pattern of 3 eclipses also. And what significance that is, not sure. There's information that people can follow up on. But for this particular eclipse, it means that there was a certain light that was diminished. So in this conversation today that will touch on various factors, this is just one of the indications of it, but because it happens to be on the day of the eclipse, it seems like we need to connect with that energy and discuss it. I have the honor and privilege of introducing Catie Cadge, who is a master evolutionary astrologer. She holds a master certification from Stephen Forrest, who has a wide education over many, many years. And she's a member of the apprenticeship program. She's completed 15 intensive trainings with Stephen Forrest. She's studied astrology over 30 years and is an active member of the astrology community. She's the founder of Cara Evolutionary Astrology in Santa Cruz, California. Catie consults. She teaches monthly astrology classes. She writes a blog. And Catie Cadge has a Ph.D. in art history, is tenured faculty at Anza College in Cupertino, California, and she can certainly correct me if I said that wrong. I hope not. Since 1999. I am pleased and thrilled to welcome. Hi, Catie.
Oh, thank you, Sue. Well, I'm so thankful to you and honored to be here. Thank you for letting me join your conversation and to share what wisdom I can. And happy evening following the new moon. As you said, it was early in the morning, the solar eclipse. And it's also the Perseids tonight. So it's the meteor showers. So everybody should take a look this weekend, right? And we always have that idea of the shooting star, falling star, making a wish upon the star, and that, astrologers say that even though it's quite a few hours after the actual new moon, that it continues to be a very good time to set intentions, to make a wish, and that to hold in our hearts that, where it's Leo, so where do we most need to take a risk, in self-expression, and what do we need to express to live more fully, our evolutionary intention in our chart, to express that Leo energy. How can we best do that? And so, thank you.
Oh, what a wonderful beginning. It totally is the time to consider what moves our heart. What can we let go of? I'm glad to have you just immediately focus on that, because every new moon has that intensity. And this one, it connects with Mars and Venus, which are the at the different nodes. It really wants us to be that authentic self.
Exactly. And you did such a nice job of summarizing the basic parts about looking at an eclipse. And I think, one of the things to just underscore again, as you were saying, that, the moon, in this case, partially, right, blocks out the sun. And so that it really gives us a chance, which astrologers often say, to reboot, it's almost like shutting your computer down and starting it back up. And in this case, the sun, how can we best, again, sun being the ruler of Leo, express ourself, our inner divine light? How can we put that out to shine for the world? And so often, if we look at the history of eclipses, in ancient times, most famous, your audience has probably heard, because of last year's big event, there was a lot in the media about, say, the Babylonians and their omens, the fall of the king and so on. But really in the 21st century, perhaps more, since I'm an evolutionary astrologer, more constructive to see good and bad as relative terms, and that these times, most won't feel them necessarily. I mean, eclipses happen every year. They're a very common phenomenon. However, for some folks, when they're particularly powerful in the chart, where they may trigger, say, like somebody might have a birthday today, or their natal moon, or Venus, or, that it triggers this high energy. And that, there's some basic things that people can keep in mind when they see this happening in their chart, or they go to an astrologer and they hear about eclipses, that, that they might think back, as you mentioned, the Saros cycle, or think back many years ago, 19 years ago or so, and, find when the eclipse happened again, the same degree, and are they experiencing similar things? And also to allow a certain breathing space in their life, in their calendar. I have to say, this last one recently touched my own chart, and I chose not to teach summer school. As you mentioned, I wear two hats. I'm an evolutionary astrologer, but one correction there. Yeah, I teach at De Anza College in Cupertino, and I've been teaching there for over 20 years, tenured faculty. And that, I chose to open my calendar to allow whatever might fall, because eclipses are a little bit like wild cards. I mean, some astrologers have expressed that, and that sometimes they'll manifest in ways that perhaps we may not have been expecting. And that the energy may be so wired, and because again, this the solar energy gets blocked, but then it starts again, and so there's this sense of sometimes kind of an overwhelming quality of the energy in our lives, and often sometimes new beginnings. closures to something, and then we start something new.
Well,
Those are ideas. Sure, go ahead.
Tremendous.
Sorry.
No, it's tremendous. Like a song, it's been referred to. The song ends and the dance goes on, but it's a new beat, a new rhythm. It may not be your genre that you like, but yeah, how do you find that step? Or maybe the partner, it's no longer with a partner, it's individual. So
Definitely. And in this case, in Leo, and as you mentioned also, some of the Mars energy that had been in play, Mars being retrograde, and we can talk about retrogrades later in the program, and also currently out of bounds, high declination, that, especially I think for the eclipse back at the end of July, which was a lunar eclipse in early Aquarius, that the Mars energy, that's that sense of will, or how we put ourselves into action. We think of the spiritual warrior, but also how are we presenting our will? How are we finding the courage to act when we may need to, maybe in a Mars sense of protection, but also perhaps as fulfilling our destiny, which we can get to a little bit later, perhaps, because Leo is so much about being able to express the true self. It's that, again, that divine spark in us that needs to shine. And sometimes we tend to water Leo down with various types of stereotypes, partially rooted in truth. There's a statistical bump. We might see, someone that's flamboyant, or, we think of the famous actor or Mick Jagger on the stage, all that Leo energy. But not everybody manifests Leo in that way. Leo's in everybody's chart, and it's much stronger in some charts than others. But what is that authentic self-expression? What, again, to get back to, I'm an evolutionary astrologer, so thinking about evolutionary intention of our soul. Our soul has come in with a rather complex natal mandala chart, that's our map. And Leo is going to be very different. Yeah, I'm sorry, just one other point real quick. Even something as simple as like a Leo ascendant, somebody perhaps is born with Pluto on that Leo ascendant. And this is just one little piecemeal, right, of a detail, again, of a much larger chart, but it's going to be a very different ascendant. It has that filter of Pluto over that Leo rising sign. But anyway, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's so true. Integration. It is a matter of synthesis and integration, and these factors, because Leo, in this conversation, the fact that it always refers to the sun, and the sun is our umbrella, you might say, that is everything threads through in some manner. The power of that and the need to fulfill, as you've been expressing, is so important. And it can tremendously vary depending, because people could have nodes in Leo. In fact, there is the Leo generation. We refer to it as, which happens to be my generation, of Pluto in Leo. And which house is it? If it's in the first house, it's so dominant. And if it's in the 12th house, it might have more of a collective basis, but not so evident. So what you say is so true. But yet, what you're urging as a realization is the need to find expression for that, because it gives pleasure, it gives fulfillment, it's that creativity, it's in some way acknowledgement, like in our earlier conversations, has been brought up.
And and in your earlier conversations too, like I recall, this notion of dignity. We think of course, this is the royal sign, the lion or lioness. There's a certain grace and dignity to a Leo energy, but that there's also a generosity of spirit and play and childlike quality. There's this ability to just be in the moment and be undoubtedly oneself, as strongly as one can be. So that, to have the courage to do that too, must move beyond the fear, really, and have faith in self. But I think the generosity of spirit is really important, because a Leo a Leo needs to be heard. A Leo needs to have, as you were saying, the audience, needs to have that, wants to have its affection received.
Yes.
And so I think we have to always kind of keep that in mind, because I'd love to, at some point tonight, to address the Leo in terms of the polarity with Aquarius, because I know we're going to
it is
lead
immediate.
into current issues.
It's immediate. We could talk about it now, because right now Uranus is squaring the nodes, and the South Node, which Uranus rules, is in Aquarius, and it happens to be conjunct Mars. So the dynamic is essentially right there. The polarity is being begged, for people to listen to their authentic self. And again, with those, the feminine and the masculine being opposed, it's like the attraction of polarities may be out, had its day. It needs to release that. It needs to embrace, I think, the unity of it. In this particular eclipse, it's like awakening what myth of ourself no longer lives. So yes, I'm glad we can.
Yeah, and I think to help the listeners, because there may be, again, some listeners that are less familiar with astrology or the current moment in the sky, but back in May, Uranus entered the sign of Taurus. And as a fixed sign, it's square or 90 degree to Leo, Aquarius, this polarity, the two opposing signs that we're discussing. And that Uranus moving into Taurus, Uranus moves very slowly. It's a 84 degree orbit. And so it's been quite a while, since it's been in Taurus. And it's also going to be going back into Aries in November for a few months. So this period's just really starting. In fact, it's quite intriguing to look ahead to, which again, this might be jumping ahead to later on in our program, but to the 2020 election year, because it's really going to be strongly squared then, the U.S. Nodal axis. But
which
just
it
to
is
get back
now,
to the basic,
right.
Which it is now, but to get back to the basic point, just so everybody's following us, is that Uranus in Taurus is an energy that we think of where there's a possibility of challenges in terms of our resources. Uranus is upset. It's the planet of revolution, and is sometimes like lightning bolts and thunder. It's difficult to know how Uranus is going to manifest sometimes.
Yes.
And to have it in Taurus at a time when I'm really hoping, it's the biggest prayer I have every day, are waking up to the reality of global warming. And it's one thing to notice that during this period since May and ongoing months that there's been a lot of shifting in our Earth, some of which, of course, is quite natural. The Pacific Rim, the volcanoes, in Hawaii and in Indonesia, the earthquake and so on. But a lot of too, especially here in California, and I believe in the Northwest where you are, the realities of the fires that are just hitting us every summer. And so this awakening up, Uranus is also the great awakener, opening our eyes to this is real, and I think you and I and probably most of our listeners are probably already on board with a lot of this, but I think now is the time where it's reaching a kind of critical threshold of the awareness really needs to happen. And that also, if we think back in time when Uranus was last in Taurus during the Great Depression, how we had, FDR and the New Deal building infrastructure in our country, because we also think of Uranus as technology in some respects, and building, what we need, Taurus, in terms of transportation or agricultural projects and so on, the WPA, the support for the arts tour,
Yes.
Taurus is also ruled by Venus, that we're going to perhaps see some of that, we hope, shift, right? But it's also the Great Depression, so we could see some economic challenges, which I'm not strong personally in predictive astrology. I'm more of an evolutionary astrologer. I believe in looking at the potential of the individual's chart, but you really do have to consider all this mundane astrology to get the best reading you can, and to help see, perhaps like in this case with the new moon in Leo, because I'm hoping we could talk about Leo maybe in a few minutes here, in its more complex archetype rather than the misconceptions, because not every Leo is going to have that divine spark about social justice or about saving the planet or about, again, that polarity of thinking. I'm thinking of perhaps the collective in the 11th house Aquarian sense. Some Leos create art because art gives pleasure. It's play. It helps us to be human. There's nothing wrong with art for art's sake. Art because we want to play a beautiful symphony, or we want to take a picture of a gorgeous sunset. And, there's nothing really wrong with that type of expression of Leo, or even the great theater actor, who gets us to cry because we feel pathos. That's all a gift, right? A generosity of spirit that Leo can share. But with that said, I know you have had a couple programs on the Leo archetype. I think there are some Leos today, that perhaps are part of what I like to think of as our program title, in terms of our tree of light, in terms of how are we going to get out of the mess that we're in? We're in a cosmic web of life. How are we going to best serve that? What's our special destiny? How can we express ourself, our divine self, in a way that's unique, that will be heard, that is going to help the changes that need to occur? And so that's what I'm hoping, perhaps we can tie in with that, because the Uranus square, I think, is very much about that. And I was thinking, if you don't mind me throwing out one other idea, just to help the listener, for instance, like let's say we had, I'm making up a chart, a hypothetical chart. Let's say we have a chart of somebody who's born mid-90s, let's say 95, and they have a Leo sun in the 5th house. And much of that soul's intention is to be recognized, existentially, for what it has to give and express. It has to have that courage to express its inner heart, its inner flame, its fire, take the initiative, do it, be spontaneous, what makes that soul unique, and be received properly. But let's say this same person, this is generational, right, is also born with Neptune and Uranus conjunct in Capricorn in the 11th house, right, which is possible with it, in that type of chart. That's a collective energy. But if we were to look at, and I'm just making this chart up, so I have no idea, where the moon is or other aspects, but perhaps we can see that this person definitely has a creative role to play, and definitely one of fun, 5th house, romance probably, and a lot of other 5th house associations that we think of, taking risks, gambling. I mean, it's old, that old time association of the 5th house with risks, with gambling. But let's say the aspects and other parts of the chart say this person's also part of that collective movement. And we know that generation, probably like other generations in other ways, are going to touch the kind of social change that we need to see take place, like, for instance, in the next election, in 2020 or so on. So I'm just throwing that out there just for food for thought. That particular Leo expression might be very much about social justice, or about economic justice, or about changing our society so our planet survives. That's what I hope to spark in people that I meet. Yeah,
beautiful. That's beautiful.
Thanks.
Well, just today or yesterday, you touched on quite a few things, but one of them is in Seattle, there's an article that says we've started living climate change, not just studying it, science say. And so, yes, indeed, it's a global thing. And we, too, also have up here an orca which I think internationally has had a lot of effect. And for 16 plus days, this, which is, from what I've read, very unusual, but this mother has been carrying her deceased calf. And that particular pod lives on Chinook. And so the Lumi native tribe has found Chinook. But the problem is that the orcas are up in Canada. But it does signify exactly what you're saying about just reflecting on one terms about this energy that's asking us, that we've been discussing, Uranus in Taurus, that is giving some conflict to our nodes and to ourself individually and collectively. It's that whole axiom, that polarity that's really significant. At this moment, I'm going to give our phone number to our audience for anyone to call in if you have questions for either Catie or myself, or if you have any comments that you want to join in with us. And then we'll have an announcement. And then afterwards, if people have called in, fine, we'll talk with you. And otherwise, we'll continue our conversation. And that number is 425-373-5527. 425-373-5527. Thank you. While we take a break from this week's edition of Talk Cosmos, let's take a look at this cycle's archetype. We are currently in the Yang period of Leo, ruled by the solar sun. Having departed from a cycle based on the internal process of emotional attachments requiring security and safety, the energy of Leo externally manifests our legacy through children and artistic creations. As a fixed Yang fire sign that desires to ignite actualization, Leo the lion takes the risk to generously exhibit love and welcome all to share their stage with joyous pleasure for living life.
Welcome. This is Amanda Pierce, astrologer and paradigm shifter, and you're listening to Talk Cosmos on Alternative Talk 1150 AM, where we understand how to implement our free will through the cosmos.
Hi again. This is
Hi, Sue.
Very good. It's Catie Cadge with Sue Rose Minahan, and we're going to continue on unless somebody calls, and I'll just give that number, 425-373-5527. Hi, Catie. Yes, you wanted to talk about
if I could just comment a little bit on your previous
love it.
Your statement about Uranus and Taurus. I think and also the recognition that the public is making up in the Northwest of this orca mom who, bless her heart, I mean, has been carrying this baby.
Such grief, yes.
Yeah, and that Taurus is very much about being in the body. You know, it's very much about the simplicity and directness of being an animal, of being part of the larger web of life, beyond, say, the intellect, or let's say Scorpio, which perhaps we can get to a little later with Jupiter, which actually has been squaring the recent eclipse. But that this simplicity of Taurus to feel with one's body the realities of global warming, you know, to feel also in our hearts, you know, what this mom has been doing. And, you know, I was thinking about this a lot today because I was actually talking to a good friend about this who is from the Northwest, and she was suggesting that perhaps this is a kind of ritual that this pod is doing, and how powerful it is. If you don't mind me sharing, it's many years ago, but I lost a child myself at birth, and it took our culture, our society, many, many years until quite recently to let the mother hold the baby and to have a funeral, and the importance of naming our children, that pass away as young infants or at birth, or, and this idea that perhaps this pod, I often think these orcas are smarter than us, to tell you the truth, and that at the same time, I thought, how Leo in a way, because now it'd be more like Leo in the 12th, like you were saying before, or Leo in a different house, perhaps, than the 5th. But this idea that she's showing the world, she's demonstrating through a kind of performance, right, about how we need to wake up or be aware. Now, it's very scorpionic because obviously it's this taboo issue of her little baby has died, and I believe this pod has had trouble having children. So it almost has a kind of handmade quality to it. The story of that's recently been very popular about thinking about our own fertility, as we destroy our planet. These are kind of rather taboo subjects. So really strongly scorpionic. And again, interesting to think of Jupiter now, really one of the only few planets that's going direct, yes. Creating a square with the Leo energy, and so with Mercury and so on. So, this idea that perhaps there's more to this ritual of this mother grieving, and certainly, again, like a kind of witness. Now, I know that our listeners probably come from a variety of various faiths or religious background, or perhaps no religion at all, perhaps atheists or goddess centered. But when I was thinking about this new moon, I couldn't help thinking about, there's a famous quote that I'm sure you've heard of, and I'm sure most listeners have heard, from the Christian New Testament, St. Matthew, a gospel, about how we have this light in us, and we're all called to shine. We don't put that light under a bushel, right? We put it on the lampstand for everyone to see, because by doing that, now Leo, of course, needs to feel cherished and heard, and so wants people to see that light. But in the larger scheme of things, in the larger web of life, it's also about showing these divine gifts that are going to somehow help humanity, right? So that they honor God or a goddess. Maybe it's a Buddhist context, right? Where maybe God's within the self. But it's that idea that by expressing it, we then become part of God or goddess's message, the divine message. And that's where, in some ways, I see some interesting reflections in terms of, well, one thing, some of the retrograde motion, which again, we can get into a little bit in a few minutes, but our program title, because our tree of light, Leo is very much about ego in a good sense, what makes us unique, what is that spark in us, but it's also our tree of light in perhaps the more Neptune and Pisces sense of we are all part of this bigger picture. And so our special destiny, again, not always, I think sometimes with Leo, it might be again about just pure pleasure, Mick Jagger or Jerry Garcia, another very famous Leo, getting up there on the stage and moving people spiritually through music, or again, a beautiful painting. But sometimes that special destiny might reach out to ways where it's tapping into some of those other, again, it would depend on the individual's chart. As an evolutionary astrologer, again, it's seeing the bigger picture of the mandala, right? So looking at the larger, the aspects of the chart and so on, but that how it may somehow, hopefully, I'm really hoping, and again, this is another prayer of mine, that we collectively, right, are able to contribute to change. So you had mentioned earlier in the introduction about, I have been a professor for many years in art history. And sometimes people get confused. One of the first things they say is, oh, you must be a painter, or you must be an artist. And it's not that. It's so I have a very particular take on creation, on creative expression. And my particular take is actually more towards the fire sign, which is later on in the year when you get to that archetype of Sagittarius, because I think our listeners probably know basic points about a birth chart. I have Sagittarius very high in my chart, so it's on my midheaven. And so it's about experiencing cultural diversity and supporting diverse cultural expression of art, right? And so again, Leo is not always about that. Leo can take a lot of different forms when the soul is just trying to allow itself to live life fully and to express its heart. But given the state of our planet at this time, I think it is really critical, and I thank you, for having me share some of what I hope are halfway decent ideas, because this part about thinking about that we all have Leo in our chart, and a lot of us, I think, are really called in one way or another, to let that light shine, but perhaps to help us to work and lead into an Aquarian age, or an age where I've been hesitant to use that term, but, with the polarity of Aquarius, in the sense of the larger collective and, being the outsider, being the rebel, changing our world to make a better world, right? And of course, Eclipse is so much about change, right? On some levels, depending again on how it resonates with a person's chart. One of the things I hadn't mentioned earlier about eclipses, just real quickly too, is because you had mentioned this a little bit, they come in a series. And so if our listeners are curious, they might again look at the eclipse we had at near the end of July and back earlier in July, for a theme that might have to do perhaps with what's their authentic true self.
July 12th. And July 27th.
27th, yes. Yeah, right. And, what is their true self? And but again, it would depend on their natal chart. But I just think that's important to think about along with this. But I don't know if you would like to. I had maybe you have some ideas of how we can continue. But there's this notion of the program title that I thought was very interesting. Kind of touched on that a little bit already. But also thinking about this retrograde energy.
Absolutely.
If you would
it's
like
involved
to
because
explore that.
It is involved because if you look at an eclipse, we're taking little parts, which of course one does, in order to understand, but it is that entire package, including us, the entire package, which essentially is when one expresses their voice, is the whole package. And I really love the idea of your speaking earlier. There's so many things I'd love to talk about, but because the idea that the diversity of voices through cultures. But I think, Catie, decide whether you want to speak for Capricorn or Sag, because I would love to have you back for Sag. But anyway, going back to the retrogrades, we have an enormous amount of planets going retrograde. There's 6, and with Chiron, which is a dwarf, would be 7. So really the only ones that aren't is Venus and Jupiter. And as it was pointed out once before to me, that Jupiter just came out of a retrograde and within about a month ago, and then Venus in a month or so will be going into it. So retrogrades, as it's pointed out by Rick Levine very often, who really bears repeating on this, retrograde is the closest to Earth at that time. The apparent from Earth is that it's the closest, and it appears to be retrograde, and therefore it's very loud. The message is loud. And I just heard him speak on a program yesterday, how he was saying that in ancient times it was so loud that people would shut it off. They didn't have ways to maybe learn or how to integrate, because that's what it's really wanting to do, is integrate it. But it's so loud that they turn it off and therefore project that onto other people or onto circumstances. But consciousness now is rising. There's so many more opportunities for people to. So going back to this process of retrograde, those planets are Mercury, which happens 3 times a year, Mars, which happens every 2 years, and when it does, stays in a sign for 7 months, although it's going back to Capricorn from Aquarius. And then we have Saturn, all the outer planets from Saturn on out, which is Neptune, Uranus. I said that mixed up. It should be Uranus. And Pluto.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, there's a couple of things that came to mind as you were talking. Well, one thing, I love Rick. I love some of his images. And, he has that, Rick Levine, as you were saying, that image too, that I think really helps the listeners in case we have some listeners that are new, though really most people, I think in the general public, have some awareness, especially around Mercury retrograde at this time, thanks to the renaissance in astrology that's been partly built through social media.
And online, right?
And we got to thank Uranus for that, I suppose. Yeah, online. But Rick has this image, too, that I think helps people see of two trains, moving at different speeds, and that sensation that I think just everybody has experienced of one train appearing to move backwards as you're moving ahead. And that is truly what retrograde is about. It's not about an actual backward motion. It's an illusion that's created.
Our experience.
So thanks to Johannes Kepler in a lot of ways for my thoughts about this. But, that the whole retrograde period, I couldn't help thinking how ironic in a way that this new moon in Leo, of course it's summer and this would be the time to have this Leo new moon, but is happening with the eclipse because of the idea that Leo is so much about play and being spontaneous. And I was thinking about it even in my own chart. I have Leo rules my 6th house. It's between the 5th and 6th, but it's on the 6th house cusp. And how much I kind of revel's a great Leo word, in being with my class as a teacher and just letting things flow and just being there in the moment and having a kind of childlike enthusiasm, for what I'm doing. And the 6th house, for our listeners, if they're not aware, is about daily routines and work and service and mentorship. So the student-teacher dynamic and so on. So Leo has that kind of, again, that fire. It's a fire sign, that initiation, that burst of enthusiasm that we don't think of so much as being reflective, in the brain, right? That it's in the heart. It's letting the heart speak. Whereas retrogrades, despite the often, and rightfully so, there is some, statistical bump again where we'll see glitches and things that'll happen during this period. But retrogrades are really a time of right? To reevaluate, return, restore, just reconsider, right? So it's really more about a time with Mercury retrograde, a time to kind of think through whatever, 14 degrees Leo, let's say, which I believe it was last night with the eclipse.
Mercury.
What that means in our chart, right? And it's not necessarily a quote unquote shy person if we see that in the natal chart. Actually, it's funny because I just recently, just for fun, I had pulled the chart of Mick Jagger. That's why I mentioned him earlier. And I believe his Mercury was retrograde, and I believe it was 14 Leo, which is kind of interesting. It's kind of synchronicity,
Yes.
But I don't think anyone would ever think of, Mick Jagger as being, a more introverted type, right? So that Mercury retrograde can often have this great reflective mind, and so this time to me it just seemed ironic, right? Because again, this thrust of being our true self, of just taking the risk, of allowing, not being afraid and having faith in the self. But then there's so much about it because again, there are a lot of other planets retrograde, as you're saying, and Mars retrograde too, and these thinking about these planets as ways of, well, what is it actually that I'm trying to express, and so I think it's fascinating, and I think it is a definite place for it, as there is always, for probably all of us. So I would encourage our listeners, if they're wondering about all this, to look again. What were these degrees we were mentioning? And you mentioned a bunch earlier in the program. And, how did they fall in your natal chart? And does any of this resonate with you? And again, wish upon that falling star. There are going to be a lot of shooting stars tonight, and ask the universe, where is it that I need to take a risk, in self-expression, as I was saying earlier, where do I need to just let myself shine, so I want to make sure I, underscore that for folks that, might be saying, well, how can I use this new moon and this time, this eclipse, as productively as I can? I'd also like to make one quick mention, too, because I mentioned that renaissance that's been taking place with astrology. And you and I both, I think, we go back in time. And, I was never a professional astrologer earlier on in my life, but I started doing astrology really quite young, and in the day of paper ephemeris and so on, and teaching ourselves. And now we're in this time where there's just a wealth of information, and we have to use our critical reasoning, of course, and critical thinking. But we're at a time where a lot more information is accessible. And so that to tap into that perhaps is good, but also to, we are living in a time where we have to be very careful about what we read. So it's very common, for instance, to read about Mercury retrograde only in the negative sense, or Mars retrograde, the classic thing, don't have surgery under Mars retrograde because Mars rules knives and action and so on. But, to think that, well, that's one way of looking at it, but there's other ways to look at, especially in evolutionary astrology, because evolutionary astrology is really about soul growth. It's really about finding how can we become our most authentic selves, so. Any thoughts on that? Or
Well, I do. Looking at the whole chart and a few points that have been mentioned, but because Mercury is conjunct right there with the sun and the moon, I mean, it's within 4 degrees, which is definitely conjunct. And so it's absolutely involved, and though it is retrograde, but it's being squared exactly by Jupiter, which means what? It means that it's our belief structure. It's looking at new information that's coming in, and information which from a mercurial way, and it can either both gathering and also refining that information. It's a whole process in itself. And in a wonderful way, being in Leo, you can just express, just try little things, risk as it goes. But it is in order to feed and create out of that conflict of the square, the 90 degrees square that's trying to recreate a new belief pattern, a new sense of philosophy of
exactly. Yeah, my primary teacher has been Stephen Forrest, and he has this wonderful way of describing Mercury as the omen, and we have to have an open mind with this term omen, I think, depending again on one's particular background. But omen in the sense that there's ways of seeing or viewing the world, like you've been describing in many ways, like that perceptions that may come to us in ways that we're not even necessarily anticipating or fully understand, so that, and I think I'd be safe to say I would underscore that with Mercury retrograde, but this period, and Mars out of bounds, really, because you're thinking about, the rebel spirit, putting
and in Aquarius
into action in Aquarius, but that, so that these omens, to be aware and let synchronicity speak to us, because synchronicity is really very much mercurial in many ways. I mean, if we think about it, it's like messages coming in and messages going out, and that Mercury is not just about communication, that we so often hear, though it, of course, plays a big role in that. but yeah, like allowing the universe and the world around us speak to us, and in Leo to speak to our heart.
Yes, and that actually Uranus, which we've been discussing as emphasis, and Jupiter are both very intuitive. In fact, yeah, and going back a little bit to the Orca as a touchstone, that there is this, you might say, shamanic way, which we're speaking of as a messenger, as a statement of also identifying that we're past just what you see is what you get. It's also like they know in the universe there's this energy everywhere that we have names for as dark energy or dark matter that actually mean that what we see is only 5% of the entire universe, which totally shatters the perception.
And I think our world, there's, as we discussed earlier in the program, so much tragedy around the exploitation of the planet, the master narrative of the settlement in our country, the West, and, the exploitation of natural resources and so on. But there's also been, with the rise of, we could take it back centuries in time, but I was just thinking of the 19th century, quote unquote, age of reason, coming out of 18th, 17th century. But this notion that ceremony, and ritual has somehow evaporated. We even find that in our churches today. I hope I'm not offending any listeners, but I have been in various services, and I'm talking all faiths, where it's purely about community, which is a great thing. It's about giving each other support through community and through tradition, which is, a very strong Capricorn notion, which again, we'd earlier talked about some of the Capricorn energy that's coming up and in play right now, actually, as well as Saturn and Pluto. But that there's somehow a loss of the shamanic element that, and with Jupiter and Scorpio, it's such an opportunity for that, to tap into these types of taboo, whether it's the occult, and even the word occult, people cringe when they hear that.
Which only means change.
It's just so ridiculous. I mean, it's just being open to perhaps there's something underlying the surface that we are not completely fully aware or tapped into yet, and that we want to honor those changes. I mean, one of the things that's coming up, I wasn't anticipating mentioning this, but since we have a minute here, just kind of throw it out there for food for thought. But, this upcoming Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn.
In 2020.
And, in 2020, I think by the time of the election in 2020, it pulls away from an exact conjunction, but Saturn is still in.
I think it's January 11th.
Okay, and again, it's like we could look up the date later, but it's just I was just thinking about like these two archetypes coming together, and that how often in the past. There are, Richard Tarnas, has spoken, in Cosmos and Psyche about, some of the kind of vast periods of history where there's been there's certainly political structures that rise and fall, but also a kind of shift in whatever we see collectively. And again, there's so many cultures around the world, and our world is a very diverse planet, but the notion of a need for faith, and how swings of, say, the entrance of, say, and of course we're living in a time where Neptune's in Pisces as well, but these times when various faiths have arisen, and today often there's a lot of, and rightfully so, but a lot of questioning about, because there's been so much of a history of the problems with institutional religion. But I think to heal the planet, and also to heal ourselves as collectively and humanity, is we need to be able to tap into that scorpionic energy that you were mentioning. Yes. We need to be able to have ceremony and ritual like that orca
And
whale.
Catie,
We
you're
need
right.
to honor
Yep.
that.
And we only have a couple of minutes. I think this is a
Okay.
great place to comment that emphasis. And I will say that I'll go back to the idea that you had just mentioned about using this new moon to connect with one's heart and also to allow that spontaneity, as you often have said, that's always going to stay in my mind. I love it, of actually letting the synchronicity of the moment and to allow. So next week we will have Catherine Zumstein. She is from Maine and she's spoken before. I think it was on June 2nd, and she'll be finishing up the Leo. And tonight we've had Catie Cadge. Catie, tell me, and then we'll have to sign off, the name of your wonderful Kara Evolutionary Astrology, which I just said, but go ahead and say it, and then we'll say goodnight.
CaraEvolutionaryAstrology.com.
Wonderful. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We look forward.
Thank you, Sue.
It's been great.
Blessings to you.
All right. We'll see you again.
Thank you for listening to Talk Cosmos, the show where Sue Rose Minahan and guests unveil astrology's ancient archetypes that continually build the collective experiences in our unconsciousness. Be sure to tune in next Saturday at 6 p.m. to continue finding your roots in the stars.
The preceding audio was via a Skype call.